Vice aired parts 1 and 2 of its season premiere episode of the Benoit family tragedy that served as the opener for season 2. And it was probably the heaviest content of the entire season because it stands as the greatest tragedy in the history of the wrestling business. I mean, lots of wrestlers have died under very tragic circumstances. They've died young. But 3 people died here. 3 people who had no business dying, and 2 people who were not given a choice in the matter. Chris Jericho said it nearly destroyed the wrestling business. And the Chris Benoit that he knew, had he been in his right frame of mind, as much as he loved the wrestling business, if he knew that what he did nearly destroyed the thing that he loved so much, he would have been devastated. I thought they did an excellent job of walking us through the man's life, the life and death of Eddie Guerrero, which severely affected Benoit. You know, you can't point to any one reason why he did what he did, but there's a lot of things that you can point to as building up over time that would have sent this man over the edge. It was like a ticking time bomb. But I never got the sense in watching this that they were glorifying him. They were going out of their way to really praise or glorify him in any way, which they shouldn't, because he does not deserve to be glorified. You know, Dean Malenko was interviewed for this. He said it best. What he did was unforgivable. It was unimaginable and unforgivable. Even if by the end of the second episode we had Nancy's sister say that one day she could see herself forgiving Chris for what he did, she said today is not that day. But yes, maybe one day. What he did was unforgivable. The moment he killed his son, there is no forgiveness. Not for killing a child. My mind was not at all changed by watching this. I felt the same way coming out of it as I did coming into it. Chris Benoit did something unspeakable, for which there is no good explanation, and not that it even matters. But no, he does not deserve to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, because it did come up here as well. He will never be inducted into the Hall of Fame. I can understand why his son David thinks that he will be, or he wants him to be one day. You know, that day's going to come. It's his father. He idolized him. He worshipped the ground that he walked on. And he still does. You listen to him talk about his father, he still idolizes his father. And David is a victim here too. Outside of Nancy and Daniel, he is the biggest victim out of all this. What his father did was a very selfish act. It hurt more than just the people he killed. But he will never be in the Hall of Fame. And the fact that it is even still a question 13 years later is absurd. They interviewed a lot of people for this. The real star, I thought, being Chavo Guerrero, who was also listed as a supervising producer. Chavo was Eddie's nephew, and he was very good friends with Chris, so he was very close to both of them. And having been so close to both of them, he was able to offer a better perspective than just about anybody. Chris Jericho was interviewed. He's also the narrator for the new season. Dean Malenko. And for the people, there were 2 people who asked me, what's wrong with Dean Malenko? For those who don't know, if he seems a little off or if he's shaking, he has Parkinson's disease. I think he revealed that, I think it was StarCast. It was one of the StarCast events last year. He was a guest, and this might have been around the time he signed a deal with AEW. And he revealed that, in fact, he has Parkinson's. I had suspected that. A lot of people did, because he did a shoot interview in the last year or 2. And it was obvious just watching him there, the shaking and everything, there was clearly something wrong. But straight from his mouth, that's what it is, in case you were wondering. They interviewed Malenko's wife, Julie, who knew Nancy. Vicky Guerrero was interviewed. Jim Ross, Chris Nowinski, Chris's son, David, and Nancy's sister, Sandra. And they also interviewed Matthew Randazzo. He wrote the book Ring of Hell, which had a lot of details about the Benoit tragedy. It's a tough watch, and with everything going on in the world, if you're already in a bad headspace, just be aware of that going in. I mean, it's a depressing watch. It's about a man who ruined his legacy and killed himself and killed 2 other people. So you already know going in, it's not exactly a feel-good story, even if there is a feel-good moment at the very end. The thing that I wasn't prepared for with the first episode was how much it focused on the relationship between Chris and Eddie. and the death of Eddie Guerrero. It was almost like an Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit episode. And that hit me like a punch to the gut. Nancy's sister said that Nancy's first husband used to take her to the wrestling matches, which is how she got noticed. She was this beautiful woman, and they picked her out of the crowd one day. They made her a valet. That's how she first met Kevin Sullivan. This would have been mid-'80s. She subsequently fell in love with him while she was in the process of divorcing her first husband. They made it a point to talk about the influence that Nancy had in wrestling, her role as a valet, her career, which often gets overlooked because of who she was married to and what happened to her. You know, she's forever a victim, but she was also a very effective manager, you know, in WCW and then in ECW and then again in WCW. And then she just simply vanished one day. She just stopped being a character on television. Kevin Sullivan, you've heard the story about how he kind of booked his own divorce without even realizing it, with the storyline with him and Nancy and Chris Benoit in WCW. There were abuse allegations that I was not aware of. I had heard that there were issues with Chris and Nancy in the early 2000s after they were married. I don't know if it was physical abuse or just verbal and mental abuse. It might have been physical abuse. I know Nancy had filed, I think, for divorce and filed a restraining order against Chris Benoit. And then a few months later, she withdrew it. I had heard about that in like 2003, I guess is when that happened. I was not aware of the fact that Kevin Sullivan may have physically abused Nancy. So those abuse allegations came to light here in this special. Dean Malenko's wife, Julie, she was interviewed. She corroborated it, although she didn't see Sullivan hit Nancy. Only the aftermath of what she told her about Sullivan striking her and then seeing the bruises, and Julie insisted, let me take pictures to document the evidence. And the producers inserted a note about Sullivan. He was approached about the allegations, and he denies that any abuse ever took place. So that's his rebuttal. That's his position. But I didn't know about that. I didn't know about those allegations. That was what effectively drove her into the arms, I guess, of Chris Benoit at a time when she was still with Kevin Sullivan, and I think Chris was still with his wife, and they came together, and hey, it's the wrestling business, and not the first time, not the last time that sort of thing is going to happen. They got into all of the substance abuse issues that Eddie Guerrero had during his career. Another thing I was not aware of is that according to Vicky, Eddie OD'd 3 times in their home. First 2 times she called an ambulance and they saved him. Third time, she just left him there. And she went and took her girls to school. And she said she was just thinking to herself that if God is going to take him now. Because she had had enough. She was at her wit's end. They talked about Eddie's redemption, his big comeback, winning the championship, and then the closing moment of WrestleMania 20. This iconic moment that is sort of forgotten now in time, with Eddie and Benoit, both champions of their respective brand, on top of the world in WWE, Madison Square Garden, main event of WrestleMania, confetti falling, embracing, crying. I mean, it's just this big emotional moment. And I thought Chris's son, David, had a very astute observation. He said, looking back, he wishes that Eddie and his father had just retired after that moment that they shared in the ring that night. I mean, when you look at how their careers turned out after that, you know, we got more entertaining matches and segments from Eddie Guerrero, and you know, it would have been a shame, I guess, to lose some of that, but it's hard to disagree. That was their peak. They peaked in that moment. And probably physically, if nothing else, it would have been a good idea for them to go, this is a good moment to walk away on. This is a good moment to step aside, become a trainer maybe, or an agent, or do something like that so you could still be involved. I mean, that's hindsight, obviously. Looking back on it now, probably would have been best for them to end their careers on that night together in the ring as best friends. I mean, again, it would have been a storybook ending had that happened. But, you know, you got to pay it forward. And Eddie ended up putting over JBL and losing the championship to him. He tried to make him a star, and Chris lost the title to Randy Orton, who then promptly dropped it to Triple H a month later. So really, what did it even mean? I mean, that really was just, let's be honest about SummerSlam '04 and why that happened. That was their way of being able to say that Randy Orton was the youngest champion in WWE history, because they were pissed at Brock Lesnar for leaving earlier that year. That's why that happened. Chavo's story about meeting up with Chris and Eddie the next morning to hit the gym when he was talking about Eddie's death. This was on a Sunday in Minneapolis. It was the day they were doing a joint Raw and SmackDown taping. I believe it was a joint Raw SmackDown Super Show. Eddie was going to be challenging for the championship, the World Heavyweight Championship, that night in a triple threat match against Randy Orton and Batista. Batista was the champion going in. I know it's been rumored that, Eddie was going to win the title that night. I believe that's been debunked. Batista in his book even said it was Randy Orton who was scheduled to win the championship, not Eddie. But he recounts the entire story, and they all went to their rooms the night before. They were going to meet up, I think, at 7 o'clock in the morning to hit the gym. And Chavo gets a call early, maybe like 5:30-ish, from the front desk about his uncle. He's not responding to his wake-up call. We've tried multiple times. They go to the room. They try to get in. Now, the door is locked, but the latch is locked from the inside, which means somebody is obviously in the room. So they had to cut the latch off. They opened the door, and Eddie is on the ground, face down on the bathroom floor, wearing nothing but his underwear. He's got his toothbrush in his hand. Now, the main thing I did not know is that when Chavo found his uncle laying on the floor, he was still alive. Said Eddie he was still breathing. Chavo had him in his arms. He was making these gurgling noises. And then a short time later, he died in Chavo's arms. He could feel his body going from warm to cold. Now, I had always thought that he found him and he either was unconscious and they just couldn't revive him, or that he had already passed away. But to hear him tell the story of, again, how he felt Eddie go from warm to cold, I said last week, it just sends a chill down your body. Then he gets a call, and it's Chris Benoit. He's downstairs. Hey, where are you guys? And Chavo now has to break the news to Chris that his best friend just passed away. And Benoit, who is a guy who showed no emotion, just stone face all the time, starts wailing, moaning on the phone as if you would think he just lost his own child. Chris Jericho talked about the guttural moaning from Benoit at Eddie's funeral, and that he cried on Jericho's shoulders so much that it went through the suit jacket, and Jericho's shirt underneath had a wet spot. That's how much he was crying. Chavo, he made it a point. He said Eddie, he didn't relapse. The verdict was heart disease at the age of 38. Now, what he didn't say is that he had an enlarged heart from years of anabolic steroid use. That's what it was. That's what he had. His heart was enlarged because of steroid use. And he also had a painkiller addiction as well. Both of those things contributed to his death. So, yes, it's a case where he may not have relapsed back to whatever bad habits he may have had before. But, I mean, just look at them. Look at Eddie Guerrero late in his career, and look at Chris Benoit. Look at Chris Benoit really his entire career, not only in WWE. Randazzo said that the belief is that Chris was doing steroids from when he was in high school. Eddie, when he came into WCW, actually looked completely different than the way he looked a few years later. By the time he got to WWE, these were not big guys. These guys were not even 6 feet tall. I don't know. Eddie was probably, what was Eddie? 5'9", 5'10"? All muscled up. These guys had small frames. It was obvious that they were roided up, and your heart can only take so much. They even show the text messages in the second episode from Nancy to Chris when they were having marital problems. Telling Chris about how fed up she was with his roid rages and all that, and the stuff that you're on and all that kind of stuff. Both these guys probably felt that they had to be in order to get noticed. Benoit, look at who his idol was. he was almost like a carbon copy physically. You look at him, almost like a carbon copy of the Dynamite Kid. Now imagine Dynamite Kid coming up in the wrestling business back in the early 80s, in the mid 80s, late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, when he was in the Land of the Giants and all these other guys that were on stuff. You know, puffed up and big as could be. I'm sure he felt that, well, to get noticed, I've got to look the part. I'm already at a disadvantage here. His partner, Davey Boy, going into the Hall of Fame this year, if we even have a Hall of Fame. Same thing. Go look at Davey Boy Smith when he left WWE the first time in the late 80s. Even then, he was muscular, but go look at him then, and go look at Davey Boy Smith when he came back in 1991, 2 or 3 years later. Then look at him again when he came back in 94. He looked like he was about to pop. If you stuck a pin in this guy, he would pop. That's just the way things were back then. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with Eddie's heart just giving out on him. Now, Vicky is also one of the stars of this show. She was talking about Benoit and Nancy visiting her at the house after Eddie died, and she would find Chris upstairs laying in bed in the spot where Eddie used to sleep, clutching Eddie's pillow and just sobbing uncontrollably. You know, other times the kids would come downstairs and tell Vicky, "Hey, Mom, you know, Chris is up in the gym again crying." And she'd have to go up there and console him. You know, the love that Benoit had for Eddie Guerrero, it almost seemed like an unhealthy obsession that Benoit had for Eddie. And Eddie's death absolutely changed him. It destroyed this man. Did it play a role in what he did later on in his life? I believe it did. How could it not? He was never the same. After Eddie died, that's what I get from listening to everybody who knew him and his own wife or Eddie's widow. When she was around Chris, all the players involved, all of his best friends, he was never the same. You know, Nancy's sister said that all of a sudden Benoit started talking about other wrestlers that had children who were kidnapped, and he would take different car routes instead of traveling the same way. He became very, very paranoid. You know, Nancy and him would be fighting more for just reasons that she could never understand. Why are we fighting? Why are you getting so upset? Why are you getting so agitated? So they got Chris a journal. They bought Chris a book, a journal, for him to write to Eddie. And he took that journal everywhere he went. He filled those pages. I guess in a way for him it was therapeutic. And that first episode ends with the story of Vince McMahon gathering up all the troops at Monday Night Raw and informing them that Chris, Nancy, and Daniel were all found dead. And Vicky she starts screaming. She had to be consoled by Chavo because she had also been very, very close with Nancy. Nancy basically took care of her after Eddie died. She went to her house. You've got to get out of bed. You've got to live your life. You know, that's how close she was with Nancy. Now, episode 2 opened up right off the bat with that welfare check WWE called in when Benoit didn't show up to work. He had called Chavo about a day or two earlier to let him know that he wasn't going to make the live event, I guess that weekend, because Nancy and Daniel were sick with food poisoning. And Chavo said, "Oh man, that's terrible. Are you okay? Is everything going to be okay?" He's like, "Yeah." Chris is like, yeah. And I think Nancy was probably already dead by that point that he made that phone call. Daniel, I'm not sure. I think he may have also been dead. There may have been 2 dead bodies in the house at that point when he made that call to Chavo. Because you got to remember, he killed his family over the span of 2 days, and then he killed himself on that Sunday, which was the day of the Vengeance pay-per-view, where he was to have faced CM Punk, and I believe was going to win the ECW championship. Chavo had gotten text messages from Chris overnight telling him the dogs are in the enclosed pool area, the back door is open. He got the same message from Nancy's cell phone. Then he got another text from Benoit with his home address, his physical address. He didn't think anything of it. He was supposed to pick him up at the airport. That obviously never happened. And eventually they found out what happened. You know, so they showed photos from the crime scene photos in the episode, which was tough to see. You know, as far as the sequence of events, that Friday, they had a barbecue out by the pool. I think, actually, even before that, I believe the last living photo taken of Benoit, I have it on my computer somewhere. I saved it years ago from some website. But if you go online probably and type in like last photo of Chris Benoit, it's a photo of him in a doctor's office. Someone just took a photo of him. He's smiling. Dr. Phil Aston, remember him? I think he went to jail. He was the one funneling prescriptions to a lot of these guys. I believe Benoit was in Dr. Aston's office the day that he snapped and killed his wife. I think it was that very same day, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was the same day. But what happened is that Friday, he had a barbecue out by the pool. Chris and Nancy ended up having some kind of a confrontation, a verbal fight, I guess, that escalated. He tied her up with duct tape and used a telephone cord to strangle her. He brutalized his wife. This was not an act of roid rage where he just snapped in an instance and he hit her by accident, or he shoved her down and she hit her head and she died. He tied this woman up. He planted his knee in her back. He broke her back and he strangled her. And then he placed the Bible next to her body. The next morning, he gave his son Xanax, and then he murdered him in his room. He suffocated him. He placed the Bible next to his body as well. After that is when he called Chavo. He went to bed that night with his wife and son dead in their home. The next morning, he did 2 internet searches. One for a story in the Bible about the prophet Elijah and the resurrection of a dead boy in the Old Testament. Vicky had said that Chris was not religious at all until Eddie got a hold of him one day, and he gave him a Bible for Christmas one year, and Chris cherished that Bible. He took it everywhere with him. So that was one search. The other internet search was for the quickest and most painless way to break one's own neck. Up until the day he died, he was still trying to figure out if he could make a flight to get to the pay-per-view that night. Think about that. Think about if he had flown to the Vengeance pay-per-view without telling anybody that he had murdered his wife and son. Their bodies were in their home. If he would have flown to the pay-per-view and wrestled, and wrestled CM Punk and won the championship on the pay-per-view that night. And maybe he couldn't get any flights out, whatever, it didn't happen. And instead he went down to his home gym. He had half an empty bottle of wine on the scene. He wrapped a towel around his neck. He wrapped the cable from his lat pull-down machine around his neck. He placed 240 pounds of weight on it. I guess he pulled the pin and let it go and released it and snapped his neck. Now, Jim Ross talked about the decision to do that Benoit Memorial tribute on Raw that Monday night. He said, now if you remember, it was a 3-hour show. This was before the days of 3-hour Raws every week, but every now and then they would have a special episode of Raw that was 3 hours long. This was one of those shows. This was to be the tribute to the supposedly deceased Vince McMahon. They had even flown in Vince's real-life brother to appear on the show and make a cameo, Rod McMahon, who we've never seen on TV before. We were going to get to see him that night, the elusive Rod McMahon. But it never happened. Instead, they had Vince, very much alive, open the show to pay tribute to Chris Benoit, who was very much dead. And they aired all of his greatest hits, because Chris Benoit was one of the best to ever lace up a pair of boots, and he had put together this incredible body of work, and nobody will ever deny that Benoit was not one of the best in the ring. He absolutely was. And he tarnished all of that. His ladder match with Chris Jericho at the 2001 Royal Rumble, his tag team title win with Jericho over Stone Cold and Triple H that year on Monday Night Raw, his championship match with Kurt Angle at the Royal Rumble in 2003, his Royal Rumble win in 2004, his world title win at WrestleMania 20, the embrace at the end with Eddie. All of it. Never to be shown again, never to be acknowledged on television again. Some of the best matches in the history of that company. And it's as if they never even happened. And JR acknowledges the fact on the episode that they made a mistake. It was a big mistake to air the tribute that they did that night, but they did not have all the facts when they went live. Some of the talent may have suspected what had happened. I mean, William Regal, and they showed his comments on the tribute show. When he talked about Benoit, he was somewhat restrained in his praise for him. He sounded like a man who may have had suspicions about what really happened. He didn't live very far from Benoit. He was friendly. He lived in the same city or the same area, the same neighborhood. It sounded, when you watch it back, it sounded like he didn't know, but he knew. It was very strange. Benoit left a suicide note, or what is believed to have been something of a suicide note, inside a Bible that they found. It was just a note saying, "I'm preparing to leave this earth," which I believe Chris's ex-wife found. His first wife, when she was sent a whole bunch of his belongings, they shipped it up to Canada, and she found the note tucked away in a Bible. So there was a note. It was his handwriting. There was no date on it. So there's no way to know if he wrote it that weekend, if that was something he wrote before that we don't know. But they believe that to be his suicide note. Now, they talked about the media coverage and the media circus. I've gone off on this before, the whole the circus that we see with the media sometimes. In fact, everybody always says to me, "Oh, one of my favorite episodes of the Sound Off is episode 75, which was like a 20-minute show that had nothing to do with wrestling. It was my rant on the death of Michael Jackson and the media circus around the death of Michael Jackson and how absurd, how positively absurd it was." Well, before we had Michael Jackson, we had Chris Benoit and the media circus that ensued after Benoit, where they were trotting out on like Court TV or HLN or some of these networks. Remember Nancy Grace, Nancy Disgrace, as I call and always will call her, because that woman is an absolute disgrace. Thankfully, she's not on, I can't even say she's not on television. She might be on some other obscure television network. I know she's got some show still somewhere. Hopefully she's living in obscurity. Hopefully very few people watch or listen to what she has to say. The woman is a disgrace. So you had Nancy Disgrace, and you had all these other people having wrestlers on, and we have from the WWE, we have the Hitman, Bret, who calls himself the Hitman, Bret Hart, is on the show tonight, and we have this person, we have that person, and it wasn't just her show, but the narrative about steroid, they just honed in on it's a steroid story, and all these different things. It was an absolute, it was appalling the way the media jumped on this story. And David talked to the special, he goes, the media scrutiny and everything, the media coverage, it was too much. I think he told Chris Van Vliet when Van Vliet interviewed him a few months ago that he had to leave school, for a while. He couldn't even go to school. He couldn't live his life. It wouldn't leave him alone. It was terrible. It was awful. So yes, the media coverage after that was disgusting. You had the representatives from WWE who in some cases made just a fucking joke of themselves. Ken Kennedy going on one of those Fox News shows and doing the whole thing. I think he was arguing against steroids or whatever it was that he said was incredibly stupid, and he was roundly mocked for it, as he deserved to be. But, you had other people from WWE. I remember Fit Finlay being on one of these shows. And Fit Finlay is a guy who, like Benoit used to be, and people like this, a guy a lot of people respect. And there he is, touting the company now. Well, we put smiles on people's faces. I remember that whole narrative. We in WWE, we put smiles on people's faces. And I had to listen to this shit over and over again. And they had Steve Blackman and Mark Merrow. All these people came out of the woodwork. I think it was was it Eddie or Benoit? Probably the Benoit stuff. I think the Warrior, the Ultimate Warrior, went on like Sean Hannity's show, Hannity and Combs, and just all of these people coming out of the woodwork. And just some of the shit that they said was absolutely ridiculous. So yes, I remember that well. I think every wrestling fan who lived through that period remembers that well. WWE insisted that steroids had nothing to do with these murders, and it may have been true that it wasn't the root cause. It was maybe one of the causes. The idea, though, that he wasn't taking steroids is debunked by the fact that the toxicology report showed that he had a ridiculous amount of testosterone in his system when he died. Now, there's a lot of people who will abuse steroids or take steroids or growth hormone or whatever it is over an extended period of time, who then have to go on testosterone treatment. It just, I guess their system just stops naturally producing it. You can get an exemption for that. My understanding is the amount that Benoit had in his system was ridiculous, and the fact that he passed his tests. The idea that, whoa, steroids, there were no steroids involved here is a joke. I think everything played a role. I don't think it was just one thing. His steroid use, the brain damage that he did suffer, the CTE they found, the death of his best friend, the death of more than one friend, all in a short period of time. He was very close with Johnny Grunge of Public Enemy as well. Johnny Grunge lived right near him. And in fact, there is a scene in the documentary where Benoit is sitting in his car with Daniel. Daniel's actually in the driver's seat. Benoit's in the passenger seat. The windows rolled down. There's Johnny Grunge. Comes over, shakes Benoit's hand. Hey, guys, what's going on? He was very close with Johnny Grunge as well, and he also died. You know, this whole period where Eddie died and Grunge died, and I think there was another wrestler, I forgot his name, Bison. Oh, who was it? Oh my god, I forgot who it was, but there was somebody else that Benoit, who I think used to work with and respected, and he passed away. All in a short period of time. Had to be a mindfuck for this guy, and had to play a role in his state of mind. But none of it can excuse what he did. None of it. Chris Jericho, he helped facilitate the reunion a few years ago between Nancy's sister and Chris's son David, her nephew. He gave each of them the other's phone number to connect. Sandra called David first. They talked on the phone for 2 hours. You could see David glowing when he talks about being reunited with his aunt. They went to the All In show back in 2018 together. They have footage of them at All In, and that is earlier when I referred to this feel-good moment. That's the one feel-good moment coming out of this at the end, was seeing the two of them come back together and just reuniting, you know, that part of the family. So at least there's some positivity there that it ends on there at the very end. I thought it was an incredible look back at one of the saddest periods in just the history of the business. I mean, I can't sit here and say, oh my God, it was great, it was fantastic, because it makes you want to just go in the corner and cry and just shut the blinds and just pretend the world doesn't exist. But I thought they did a good job of just recapping all of the key events and interviewing a lot of the key players. Not sensationalizing it too much. You know, they have the reenactments. I know that bothers some people. I don't mind that. It reminds me of the old Unsolved Mysteries TV show with Robert Stack. And they used to have these very haunting reenactments of what happened. That's what it reminds me of. But I don't think it's being done in an exploitative, you know, kind of way. I thought it was well done. They did have a post show called After Dark. They have a half-hour post show that's going to air after each episode. Comedian Chris Gedhard is the host. Chavo Guerrero and Tommy Dreamer were his guests this week. Everybody was hooked up via Skype or whatever they use, right? Social distancing. You got to social distance from each other. So they weren't in studio, but they aired 2 cut scenes, one with David and one with Chavo, talking about the hateful comments that they both get on social media. There's still idiots who tweet Chavo, you know, the dogs are in the enclosed pool area and stuff like that. And he doesn't think that they understand the impact. And they don't. The impact that those comments can have on the friends and the family. And to this day, they still tweet shit like that to him. They talked, they had a cut scene talking about Benoit's time in Japan coming up in the dojo there, and talking about CTE. And Tommy Dreamer tells the story of once getting 3 concussions in the span of a week when he was in ECW. He also wrestled Hardcore Holly in a match on Velocity once. He got smacked in the face by Holly so hard, he blacked out. He wrestled another 9 minutes, and apparently he has no memory of the match. And it surprised Bob, because Bob went over to him and said, hey, you did great. You would never know that you were knocked out. That's one of the scariest things I find about... I've never had a concussion that I'm aware of, but I interact with enough people on social media to see a lot of people who clearly have brain damage. And one of the things that really strikes me, when you hear these wrestlers or these athletes tell these stories about their like really bad concussions that they have, it's like their body just goes on autopilot. So, like, if you're a wrestler, you have an idea of where you're supposed to go in the match, your spots, or what the finish is going to be, where to be positioned. And they could be completely just in la-la land. They have, and after the fact, have no memory of anything, but yet they're able to hit all their cues. They're able to hit all their spots. It's as if the body just goes on autopilot, but then you can't remember a thing. Undertaker told the story on the Broken Skull Sessions about the match with Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 30, when the streak ended. He has no memory of that match at all. He suffered a concussion early in the match. His memory only extends as far back as 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then his memory picks up again when he was in the hospital overnight. He has no memory of WrestleMania, the entrance, the match, the post-match. But he finished the match, right? He got up when the match was over and walked to the back before he collapsed, apparently. It's scary. It's very scary when you hear stories like that. Now, I talked a little bit about this at the end of my Dynamite stream, but not everybody may have heard it. I think it's worth mentioning here that the producer and the director of Dark Side of the Ring were on Chris Jericho's podcast about a week or two ago. And, gave some insight into the making of the episodes and why they picked the subjects they picked. And I was curious to hear what they had to say about the Owen Hart episode, which I believe is being saved as the finale. I think that's the season finale, so it's not going to be airing for a while. But they said, we can't do an episode on Owen Hart unless we have the cooperation of his wife and his family. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. You can't get the perspective from the man's own wife and family, his children. There's no point in doing the episode. We need Martha in order to do this, or we're just not going to do it. And it was just a matter of one of them sent an email to Martha's assistant. The email got to Martha. Martha reached out to them and asked them to submit 10, or she had 10 questions that were really thought out questions about their background. What are your intentions with this? And they said they were really well thought out. And she said, look, I'm going to be traveling. I'll be back in 2 weeks. So they had 2 weeks to answer these questions and get back to her. And when they did, she obviously liked what they had to say. She said, look, let's meet. And the director went to go meet with her and her son, Oj, Owen's son. So they got not just Martha to be part of this. They got both of Owen's kids. Owen had a son and a daughter, Oj and Athena. And they got them to be part of this as well. Oj is studying to be a lawyer. And he remembers all of the events of what happened when his father died like it was yesterday. And one of the things I did not know, and that's what I like about this show. There are little, nuggets of information slipped in there that at least I wasn't aware of. About a week or so after Owen died, Martha took her kids, or at least Oj, and flew out to Kansas City. She flew to go to Kemper Arena, which is where he died. That's where the Over the Edge pay-per-view was. She wanted to retrace his steps. So she said to whoever was there with her, I want you to take me through exactly where Owen would have gone up the stairs, all the way up into the rafters, onto the catwalk. I want to retrace my husband's steps. So she went all the way up to the catwalk at Kemper Arena. The exact trip that Owen took. She took Oj up there with her. So here's this boy, he probably was 7 or 8 years old at the time. But she wanted him to have, I guess, the perspective of this is, where your father was. This is where your dad was. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that a week later they went back to the scene, really the scene of the crime, really, if you think about it. I mean, a man fell to his death. And I just can't imagine what that must, especially for him, for the kid, I can't imagine what that must have been like. How just eerie that must have been. They interviewed, the other thing I learned is that for the Dino Bravo episode, they did find Dino's daughter. And I guess she doesn't speak any English, so they'll have subtitles on there. But they interviewed her for that episode, which is cool. I hope they interviewed Rick Martel, because he has shared a lot of details about what happened to Dino. He was good friends with him. And I know Martel doesn't do too many interviews these days, but my hope is they were able to find him and were able to interview him for that. So the episode this Tuesday is New Jack. They're going to cover New Jack on Tuesday. And again, I believe the Owen episode is being saved as the finale, which it has to be. I mean, the Benoit stuff was as heavy as it comes. The other one that's going to be very heavy is the Owen one. You got to put some distance between those two. So I think you open with the Benoit stuff, you can close with Owen, and then in between you have New Jack and Dino Bravo and the Brawl for All and David Schultz and all the other ones that they're going to be covering.